Every legal system ever written was created to solve the same problem. People were doing things to each other that someone decided needed to stop. The law didn't invent the behavior. It was a response to it, which means that everything in your criminal code, every category of offense, every definition of harm that a judge can sentence you for has a prehistoric version, a version that happened before the law existed to name it, before anyone had decided it was wrong, before there was any consequence beyond whatever the group chose to do about it in the moment. That distinction matters more than it sounds. When something is not yet a crime, the person doing it is not a criminal. They are simply a person making a calculation about what they can take and what will happen if they do. Ancient humans made those calculations constantly, every day, in every group. And the things they did, the things they got away with, the things they didn't, they would land every single one of them in a modern courtroom on charges we now have very specific names for. These are 10 prehistoric crimes that didn't exist yet and happened anyway. Number 1. Infanticide. This is the one that tends to stop people. Not because it is the most violent entry on this list. It is not. But because the victim is the most defenseless, and the perpetrator is the person who, in every framework of modern law and moral intuition, is supposed to be the protector. Archaeologist Rick Schulting from Oxford University, in studies of prehistoric infant remains across Europe, documented a consistent pattern. A subset of infant bones at prehistoric sites show deliberate perimortem trauma, marks not consistent with natural death or post-mortem environmental damage, marks consistent with deliberate killing. The infants were newborns or close to it. The deaths were intentional. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy from the University of California, Davis spent her career studying maternal behavior and infanticide across primate species and human cultures. Her conclusion was stark. Infanticide in human prehistory was not aberrant behavior. It was a calculated response to resource conditions. A second infant when the first was not yet weaned. Twins when a group could only sustain one additional member. A birth at the wrong point in a seasonal migration cycle. In conditions where every additional mouth could mean the death of existing children, the decision to end a newborn life before social attachment had fully formed was, by the logic of the group's survival, rational. This does not make it anything other than what we would today call homicide. What it makes it is something that was not processed through that framework. It was processed through the framework of winter, of food remaining, of how many mouths could realistically be fed through to spring. The decision was made by the person with the most information about the situation, and then it was over and not discussed again, because there was nothing to discuss. The law that would have named it did not exist. The grief, the evidence suggests, did. Number 2. Kidnapping. In 2015, a large-scale genetic study published in Nature analyzed ancient DNA from prehistoric populations across Europe. The findings upended several assumptions about how prehistoric groups interacted. One of the most significant findings concerned female mobility. In multiple periods and regions, women showed genetic profiles dramatically different from the men buried alongside them and from the established genetic signature of the local population. They had come from somewhere else, some from considerable distance. Paleogeneticist Wolfgang Hack from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, one of the lead researchers on the study, noted that this pattern of female movement between groups was consistent across multiple prehistoric periods and geographic regions. The movement was directional. Women moved between groups. Men largely stayed. There are several possible explanations. Exogamy, marrying outside the immediate group to prevent inbreeding, could produce exactly this pattern if voluntary and structured. But not all of the evidence is consistent with voluntary movement. Some women in these ancient populations show skeletal stress markers different from the local population from childhood. Some show evidence of trauma. Some were buried in ways suggesting they were not fully integrated members of the group they died in. Anthropologist David Reich from Harvard Medical School, in his book Who We Are and How We Got Here, analyzed the genetic evidence across thousands of prehistoric individuals. His conclusion was that female movement between prehistoric groups happened through multiple mechanisms, not all of them peaceful. Taking women from neighboring groups during raids was documented in ethnographic records of surviving hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies across multiple continents. The genetic evidence is consistent with this, having been a regular feature of prehistoric life. Today we have a word for it. Several, depending on what exactly was done and for how long. Number 3. Fraud. This one requires a moment because it is easy to assume that without money, without contracts, without written agreements, fraud as a category of behavior did not exist. That is wrong. Fraud does not require any of those things. It requires only that one person deceives another in a way that causes the second person to act against their own interests to the benefit of the first. That is as old as social living. Anthropologist Michael Gervin from the University of California, Santa Barbara studied food-sharing behaviors in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. Among his findings, deliberate misrepresentation of hunting success. Hunters who had made a kill reporting to the group that they had found nothing, then privately consuming or storing portions before the mandatory sharing obligation could activate. This behavior appeared consistently enough across separate groups to suggest it was not independently invented each time. It was a predictable response to a predictable incentive. The group norm required sharing. Sharing was costly. If you could avoid it without detection, you could accumulate private advantage in a system designed to prevent exactly that. Evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers from Rutgers University developed the theory of reciprocal altruism, which predicts exactly this dynamic. Where cooperation is enforced by social expectation rather than formal law, the incentive to defect while appearing to cooperate is always present. And the more sophisticated the group's detection mechanisms, the more sophisticated the deception required to evade them. Ancient humans were exceptional at reading each other. They were, therefore, under constant pressure to become exceptional at deceiving each other. Gossip, reputation tracking, coalition building to monitor suspected cheaters, all of this appears in the ethnographic record of surviving hunter-gatherer groups. It was the informal legal system managing a category of behavior we now prosecute with paperwork and a fine. Then it was managed with exclusion, reputation damage, and sometimes something considerably more physical. Number 4. Murder. Not warfare. Not raiding. Not the organized collective violence that occurs between groups. Something smaller and more specific. One person deciding to kill another person in the same group for reasons that had nothing to do with external threat, a dispute over food, over a partner. over status, over something we can no longer reconstruct from the bone. Forensic anthropologist Philip Walker from UC Santa Barbara spent decades studying trauma patterns in ancient skeletal populations. Among his most significant findings were what he described as interpersonal violence injuries, injuries inconsistent with warfare, inconsistent with accidents, consistent with one person attacking another at close range. Some of these individuals were not young warriors at the peak of physical capability. They were people who had been targeted by someone who knew them. Anthropologist Martin Daly from McMaster University and Margot Wilson from the same institution spent decades studying homicide patterns across cultures and history. Their central finding: the overwhelming majority of homicides in every society ever documented, including the most traditional and isolated, occur between people who know each other, over resources, status, and reproductive access. The same motives operating in groups of 30 people 50,000 years ago, where the person you killed was your cousin, your rival, your neighbor, and your only available hunter, where killing one person restructured everything the remaining group could do. The stakes of murder in a group of 30 were geometrically higher than in a city of 3 million, which did not stop it from happening. It just made the response more immediate and considerably more personal. Number 5. Slavery. The word produces an immediate association with specific historical periods and systems, which makes it harder to see what the evidence actually shows about prehistoric captivity. So set the word aside and look at the evidence directly. Individuals held by groups they were not born into, performing labor, not free to leave, present in the genetic record because they reproduced within the group that held them, but not integrated into it as full members. Reich and colleagues, in studies of prehistoric population genetics, identified anomalous genetic profiles, individuals whose DNA did not fit the expected pattern of the population they were buried in. Some were women. Some were men. Some showed patterns consistent with having been brought from considerable distance. Archaeological anthropologist Linda Fibiger from the University of Edinburgh studied skeletal stress markers across multiple prehistoric populations and found individuals whose physical development patterns, consistent with specific types of repetitive labor beginning in childhood, differed significantly from the rest of their burial group. Captive labor in prehistoric contexts left physical evidence on the bodies of the people performing it. The bones recorded what the society had no language to document. Anthropologist Orlando Patterson from Harvard University, in his foundational work, Slavery and Social Death, identified captivity and forced labor as features documented across virtually every society in the historical and ethnographic record. His analysis of the mechanisms, the social death of the captive, the asymmetric power relationship, the extraction of labor, suggests these are not inventions of particular civilizations. They are a predictable response to the incentive structure of groups with differential power. A group that wins a conflict and has captives has options. In conditions where labor was the primary limit on what a group could produce, the most efficient option was to keep them working. We gave that a name. The name came much later than the practice. Number 6. Theft. Not the abstract legal concept, the physical act. Someone had something stored. You knew where it was. They didn't know you knew. You took it. That is as old as storage itself. And storage is old. Archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef from Harvard University documented evidence of food storage in prehistoric sites dating back at least 12,000 years. Grain stores, dried meat, cached plant material, investments of labor and future survival, protected by location, by concealment, by group knowledge of who owned what. The moment a group develops the concept of stored resources, mine, kept for later, it develops simultaneously the possibility of someone taking what another person stored. The archaeology does not give us the specific instances of prehistoric theft. It gives us the evidence of what happened as a result. Anthropologist Bruce Knauft from Emory University, studying violence patterns in hunter-gatherer societies, documented cases in which theft of stored resources, particularly during scarcity, was identified as the trigger for lethal violence within and between groups. The theft itself left no archaeological trace. The violence it provoked sometimes did. Skulls cracked in ways inconsistent with hunting accidents. Bodies disposed of in ways suggesting the group was managing the aftermath of a decision rather than a death. The legal infrastructure we built around theft, property law, ownership, mechanisms for adjudicating disputes about who had the right to what, was built in response to a behavior pattern that long predated it. The cost-benefit calculation was original equipment. The moral framework was applied later. Number 7. Assault. The evidence is in healed bones. Healed, meaning the person survived. Meaning the attack did not kill them. Meaning they continued to live in some proximity to whatever caused those injuries, or were removed from it, or were protected from its recurrence. None of those scenarios are speculative. All of them appear in the archaeological record. Paleopathologist Eric Trinkhaus documented multiple prehistoric individuals with healed injuries at locations and of types inconsistent with accidental trauma. Forearm fractures in patterns consistent with defensive wounds, the arm raised to protect the head. Rib fractures at angles consistent with blows rather than falls. Facial trauma that had healed over months or years in individuals who then continued living long enough for archaeologists to find them. Someone hurt these people deliberately, not in the context of a group raid, because group raid injuries showed different patterns. In the context of whatever was happening inside the group on a specific day with a specific target. Psychiatrist Dorothy Ottnow-Lewis from New York University, in decades of research on violence, identified the key preconditions for repeated assault: proximity, power differential, and impunity. Ancient humans lived in conditions that provided all three continuously. The people most capable of violence in a small group were often those with the most resources and highest status. Those most vulnerable were those with less status, less physical capacity to resist, fewer allies. The same dynamic that produces domestic violence and repeated assault today was operating in every small group in human prehistory, without the mechanism we eventually built to address it, without any outside authority to appeal to, with only the group itself, which may or may not have chosen to intervene. Number 8. Conspiracy. This requires a moment to establish what it means in legal terms. Conspiracy is not simply two people doing something harmful together. It is the planning of harm in advance, the agreement before the act, the decision made by multiple parties in coordination to commit an offense that none of them would necessarily carry out alone. It requires intent, communication, and organization. It requires, in other words, what humans are uniquely good at: planning together across time. Anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, whose long-term fieldwork with the Yanomamo people of the Amazon basin remains one of the most detailed records of a society maintaining features of prehistoric social organization, documented what he called treacherous feasts, an occasion constructed to appear like an invitation to alliance, food, ceremony, apparent goodwill, that was in reality a coordinated ambush. The guests were invited. The plan was made before they arrived. The killing was organized, timed, carried out by multiple individuals who knew the plan and executed it together. Everyone who participated had agreed in advance. The agreement was the crime by modern definition. The killing was the evidence of it. Lawrence Keeley's analysis of prehistoric massacre sites across multiple continents consistently showed evidence of organized planning. The attack timing, consistently at dawn when targets were sleeping. The specific targeting, certain individuals captured rather than killed, suggesting prior discussion of what the raid was for. The coordination required to move armed individuals to a specific location at a specific time without detection. None of this happens accidentally. It requires exactly what conspiracy law was designed to address: the decision made in advance by a group to do harm. The law came thousands of years after the behavior it was built to prosecute. Number 9. Desecration. This one is unusual on this list because what it describes is a crime against someone already dead. Modern legal systems in every jurisdiction maintain categories of offense related to the treatment of human remains: disinterment without authorization, mutilation of a corpse, interference with burial. These laws exist because human societies have consistently decided that a person's remains retain a protected status after death. The violation of that status is treated as harm to memory, to community, to something that resists simple categorization, but that every functioning society has chosen to protect. The prehistoric evidence for what we would now call desecration is substantial. Stringer and colleagues at the Natural History Museum documented skull processing at Gough's Cave. Skulls worked into drinking vessels, human bones among food refuse. But the category extends beyond cannibalism sites. Archaeologists have found human remains in contexts suggesting deliberate desecration of enemies. Bones left exposed post-conflict. Bodies mutilated post-mortem in ways that served no practical purpose. Trophy-taking of human remains, skulls, teeth, long bones, documented across prehistoric sites on multiple continents. Anthropologist Randall Collins from the University of Pennsylvania, studying violence and ritual across cultures, identified the desecration of enemy remains as one of the most universal features of intergroup conflict in the pre-state archaeological and ethnographic record. The function was communicative. It sent a message to anyone who found the remains about what had happened and what the group responsible was willing to do. A declaration written in a medium that required no literacy. The law that eventually prohibited it was recognizing something people had always understood from both directions, as a weapon and as a wound. Number 10. The category nobody expected. Every law ever written was written in response to something that was already happening. The law against theft did not introduce the concept of taking what belonged to someone else. The law against murder did not teach anyone that killing a person was possible. These laws were written because the behaviors they address were already occurring at a cost. The group could no longer absorb without a formal response. Archaeologist Steven Pinker from Harvard University argued in The Better Angels of Our Nature that violence has declined across human history, that we are statistically safer now than our ancestors were at almost any point in the prehistoric or historical record. His critics are numerous and their objections substantive, but one point in his analysis is difficult to dispute. Ancient humans committed at high rates every category of harmful act that modern legal systems were subsequently built to address, not because they were more evil, because the systems designed to inhibit those behaviors had not yet been constructed. What distinguishes modern crime from prehistoric harm is not the behavior. It is the existence of an external authority capable of defining, detecting, and responding to it consistently and at scale. The behavior predates the definition by hundreds of thousands of years. And what the prehistoric record shows across every continent, across every period, is that the behaviors we eventually decided to codify as crimes were not learned from anywhere. They were not introduced by contact or civilization. They were present from the beginning in every group as a consistent feature of what happens when multiple humans with competing interests share limited resources and no formal mechanism for resolving the conflict. Every law you have ever been subject to was written because someone did the thing it prohibits. And in the case of every category in this video, that someone lived long before anyone had decided it was a crime. They lived in a world with no courts, no definitions, no paperwork, and no authority beyond the 30 people who shared their fire. What they did was exactly what we would arrest them for today. They just didn't know that yet. And in the most critical sense, neither did anyone else. Close. The law did not make any of these things wrong. It made them prosecutable. That is a different thing. The harm existed before the statute. The victim existed before the definition. What the law added was a framework for responding to something that had been happening in the dark for a very long time. Prehistoric humans were not innocent of these behaviors because they had no law against them. They were simply not accountable to any authority larger than the 30 people who shared their fire. And what those 30 people decided about theft, about violence, about captivity, about the treatment of the dead, was the only law that existed. We built everything else later, on top of evidence that the original version was not sufficient. It never had been.